You'll know what time it is when you hear my voice. Bitcoin is still languishing at the lows. I told you last week the volatility would decrease. Look at it. Pathetic. It's currently around 63,000 US dollars and some change. Like I predicted in every single episode, this will happen. But you kept on fighting me in the comments below. But you will learn the hard way. Every bulltard out there is calling for a bottom, saying that this is the bottom. My gut feeling tells me it's the bottom. Because everyone is calling for 30 or 40k or some shit like that. Then surely this is the bottom. And every single time they get eliminated and a new set of bulltards re-emerge. I made this video in April the 8th, 2025, when all the bulltards were calling for interest rate cuts. Bad news, and the Fed is not coming to the rescue. Like many people thought. They thought, oh, okay, you know, the stock market's crashing. Let's get the Fed is gonna come. They're gonna come to the rescue. No. My friends, no one's here to help. Imagine the Fed. They're in a fire station. They're upstairs watching TV. They haven't even got downstairs. They haven't even gone down the pole yet. And you're talking about, yeah, the Fed is coming. They're here. Look at this. The Fed watch tool has gone up to 77. Yesterday, it was at 51. There is a 77% chance that the Fed will continue to hold. This doesn't scare the Fed at all. Why would they cut right now? 99.9999% of folks are not looking at this. I promise you, no one is looking at this. This is the bond market. It's actually gone up. Interest rates have gone up. It hasn't gone down. All of this chaos in the room, in the whole economy, bonds have increased to 4.2%. Bond traders are actually saying interest rates should go higher. This is the same chart, and for almost 2 bloody years, bulltards have been proclaiming that we're going to see interest rate cuts, and then shitcoins are going to rise, and Bitcoin's going to go up higher, and so on and so forth. But the real reality is that the bond market has made up its mind. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, and as an investor, a lot of people really believe that bankers and central bankers are very important. They're not. They're trash. But they think that they think that bond markets actually follow the Fed, which is the opposite. The green line is the Fed. Whenever they have the FOMC meetings, that is when it pumps, okay? Or they just hold or whatnot. And this line right over here, the blue line, is the bond market, the 20-year bond market. And as you can see, the bond market is actually what leads. The Fed actually follow. And I was a rookie back then. I used to actually do FOMC meetings. Believe that. I used to do live FOMC meetings like an idiot. They've led the market for a while. And now, ladies and gentlemen, they're telling the Fed, Mr. Welsh, to increase and hike interest rates. I used to actually watch this filth. I used to actually watch it. Believe it or not, I used to actually sit down and watch this filth. Until you realize that they just simply wake up 2 days before, they look at the bond market, and they just follow the bond market. As simple as that. Simple as that. It's all fugazi. They use all these different numbers and words and bullshit and fugazi. And the truth of the matter is, they just follow the bond market. The bond market tells them to bow down, they bow down. So here we are where we're always meant to be. Every single bear market in August and September, we've seen drawdowns in 2022, in 2018, and in 2014. Each bear market looks remarkably similar. Different participants and different narratives. But at the end of the day, we still have our capitulatory end at the very bottom. Now, we did speak about previously that the closest correlation is actually 2018. The 2018 bear market is the one in the purple. The 2026 bear market is the one in the orange. It has a almost 85% correlation between the two. And the most interesting part is, ladies and gentlemen, we went sideways for quite some time. Market participants believed it was the bottom. They kept on saying, we've bottomed. This is the bottom. This is the end, and we're gonna recover. To see themselves puke everything, to see themselves scurry and squirm and sell at the bottoms. That's what we're looking for, ladies and gentlemen. The people, the participants right over here that are DCAing and buying will sell at the very, very bottom to later buy back. Ethereum's bear market comparison.
is very, very similar to 2018. The correlation is almost 80%. And what happened with Ethereum was similar to the same story as Bitcoin. It goes sideways for the time being. And then, ladies and gentlemen, in Q4 or Q3, whichever period, we have our final capitulation. In 2026, we had a drop over here. And then again, 2018, we had another major sign of weakness. And in 2026, we had a major sign of weakness. And then finally, we had one last capitulatory bottom that crushed the hopes of crypto participants once again. Likewise, in 2026, look no further. History always rhymes. And lastly, we have Solana. Now, Solana only has 2 data points. Unfortunately, it's comparing this one with the previous one because it only has one bear market. Now, the bear market was very similar to this one. It moved sideways in the previous bear market to finally drop once again in, guess what? Q3, Q4. Let's have a yonder. Let's have a stroll down on chain. And I like to look at this only to look at participants' psychology and what they're doing and how they're participating. Now, this is addresses with under 0.1 BTC. I like to call them the brokies. These are ones that are aspiring to grow their wealth. They probably have regular jobs. They probably just, have regular jobs and living regular lives. Just maybe some low-skilled jobs. Maybe they're just dabbling here and there at Bitcoin. They're not taking it really seriously, but they just, DCA and accumulate maybe 0.1% or maybe 1% of their portfolio into Bitcoin. They just continuously buy just a small amount, tiny amount that really doesn't harm them or affect them. They probably own a small amount of stocks. They're probably early into their careers and they want to participate in Bitcoin. It's recently picking up and they almost made all-time new highs during a bear market. Now let's have a look at the participants that own 1 BTC. Now these folks are not brokies. These folks, they have good jobs and they're looking for some sort of investment. They might hold a tiny amount of Bitcoin. Now these folks at the moment are accumulating at the moment right over here, but it hasn't made an uptick. They haven't really increased in their accumulation. These folks are a little bit more sophisticated, and when they see lower prices, they accumulate a little bit more. They are a little bit more savvy, so they were taking profits when Bitcoin was around 69,000 US dollars, and they took immense amount of profits when it was around 100,000 US dollars. Now we have the folks that have around 10 Bitcoin. Now these people in the real world, they're quite successful. They probably own a business. Maybe they're, they're very, very high up in their careers and they have a bit of money. Okay. They probably own a lot of stocks. They're probably more diversified. These folks have been distributing throughout the entire 2 cycles. However, most notably, what they have been doing is they have also been acquiring during the bear market. And it does have an uptick during the lows in Bitcoin cycle of around 17,000 US dollars. Furthermore, they're a bit more sophisticated. They have been distributing during 100K. Now we're going to look at some of the big dogs. They hold around 1,000 Bitcoin. These people are probably very, very lucky and they bought very early, or they're very, very successful in the real world. They own multiple franchises, multiple businesses, multiple real estates. They're really, really big in the real world. They probably have many different investments like stocks, art, real estate, precious metals. They invested in everything, ladies and gentlemen. These guys are really, really successful. These guys have bought heavily during the bear market, accumulated during the bear market, and have been consistently distributing. We haven't really seen a massive uptick yet, but most notably it's the folks that have 10,000 BTC. These are big whales. These are millionaires, decamillionaires, maybe billionaires, ladies and gentlemen, and these folks have been distributing the entire bull run. It has now flatlined and now they continue to accumulate at these lows. Likewise, the same thing happened right over here in the previous bear market where they were massively accumulating until it peaked in the bear market of November the 18th at 17,000 US dollars. Currently, it's moving sideways. They're not distributing, ladies and gentlemen. They are actually accumulating. And lastly, we have the folks that have 1 million Bitcoin. 1 million Bitcoin. They don't really move their funds often. You don't really see massive activity from them. They're normally dormant. They really move it once a cycle or twice a cycle. They don't really move their funds. These folks, they got really lucky. They bought at the very beginning of the bull market and they really didn't touch it, ladies and gentlemen. To acquire this much Bitcoin, you've got to be Michael Saylor at this stage. They were probably mining Bitcoin in the early days and they distributed and held majority of their Bitcoin. And here we are, where we're always meant to be. You could have all just logged off, disappeared into the night and came back in December, November, October time and logged back on. This is a carbon copy of 2022 bear market, almost identical. We formed a dead cat bounce like we did in 2022. We formed an upthrust. I was telling folks that this is the end and you should leave. And in 2022, we formed an upthrust. The news was different back then. Yet the charts look identical, almost identical. We swept the highs, ladies and gentlemen, made a pathetic high. There were no more buyers left. People were calling for higher prices of 100K, yet that never materialized until 5 years later. And likewise, many participants were calling for higher prices in 2025. They were calling for 200K, 300K, 500K, and most likely that won't materialize until 5 years later. There were no more buyers left, and we hurdled into selling climax. Likewise, the same thing happened and we hurdled into selling climax. The volume increased and this, ladies and gentlemen, was distribution. We formed a distribution pattern right over here, exactly the same. Another upthrust right over here in 2022, followed by another upthrust in 2026. There was no more buyers left and we hurdled into selling climax. The volume increased and likewise the same thing. There were no more buyers left. The volume increased and we hurdled into selling climax. The difference between this chart in 2022 is that we had 2 selling climax. The volume increased. However, in 2026 bear market, we had volume increase once and selling climax was only once. And this is due to diminishing gains and diminishing losses. Every cycle is like this. And then we had another distribution pattern. We formed an upthrust. Everyone back then was calling for institutions. Institutions are coming. They're coming. They never came until 5 years later. Likewise, in 2026 bear market, we had the same thing. Michael Saylor and his cohort are here. They're going to buy. They have financial instruments. He's the crypto messiah. There cannot be any wrong. He's going to change the cycle. And so he was carried in a body bag. He had to sell. He's selling right now, ladies and gentlemen, as we speak. And we hurdled into selling climax. The volumes increased and there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, where we're always meant to be. Now we're forming some pathetic distribution pattern. This is distribution, ladies and gentlemen. This is not accumulation. I repeat, whoever's telling you we're going up higher is lying to you. We have a clear distribution pattern. We're in this channel, ladies and gentlemen, and we're ebbing and flowing in this area. Volatility will decrease and decrease, like I said before, ladies and gentlemen, until that bloody day, that beautiful, glorious day when the strong hands finally capitulate and they scream for their mummies. In the 2018 bear market, we kept on forming lower highs after lower highs after lower highs. This was clear distribution. In this case, we're always forming lower highs. The continuation, the trend is your friend. And we formed a base right over here at this trend line until finally we broke down. It wasn't until there were no one left. There was no one left. It was boredom that set in that we finally broke down. What if this is going to play out exactly the same and we continue to oscillate around here? And then there's probably 10 people watching these videos until finally we find the bottom. Everyone calls it dead. And that's when we recover and head into spring. Once we head into spring, I'm going to show you all the comparisons of how spring actually looks like, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to show you the fractals from 2015 spring, 2019 spring period, 2021, and finally 2023 spring period. If you really want to win and really gain an edge, trust me, you won't regret it. Join our inner circle. Peace.